Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I'm Chris.
And I'm Ann, and this is Lifestyle Business. We are so excited to have you today. Our show is going to focus on some of the great cities in the Launchpad network across the U.S. So we are going to hear from Stockton here on the West Coast / the best coast, Newark and Philadelphia. That's right. So hosting us, we are going to be hosting Ann Rogan, who leads economic innovation on Mayor Tubbs' team in Stockton, Anthony Fraiser, the CEO of ABF Creative in Newark, and Brian Murry, CEO of Shift Capital. We're going to hear what's going on the ground. And we're going to be hearing from them as leaders who are creating mission-driven strategies to support entrepreneurs in underserved communities. And we're so excited to have these three because...
Well, these are all amazing people who we've been working with in various capacities to open Launchpad locations or open future Launchpad locations, and people who are real change makers on the ground in these cities, real leaders. So excited to actually get reports from the ground in each of these markets now that we're all hunkered down. You know, last year we would have been visiting. We can't visit at the moment, so
we can't visit at the moment, but wait, more on that
bring
later.
them to you.
We are excited because one of our big core values is we go long. And one of the things we talk about with that is that it's about building long-term relationships. And what's been interesting is we've been having relationships with these three individuals. I mean, they're not exclusive relationships. They're just good, solid business relationships with them. And we have been working with them for many years.
Yep.
And they were some of our first believers. And we'll talk about that when we bring Anthony on. But we're really grateful to the partners and the relationships that we have and folks who, when times get tough, you can count on. And so I'm excited about that part. But you're right. We can't travel, can we?
No, we're locked down just like everybody else.
Like everybody else. In fact, I see you, Ariel. We will adjust our lighting. We're just going to adjust our lighting rate because it's making Chris look a little bit crazy. But nonetheless, as we are not going to be traveling in the near future, and it was funny, we were chatting with someone who's refusing to cancel her vacation tickets because she can't imagine staying with her kids. And I'm like, I hate to break it to you, but I think that vacation might be canceled. I was also talking to some friends on a Zoom hangout. Driving places. And they were like, we're waiting on what camp has to say. And I'm just predicting, I'm sorry to say it, I'm pretty sure camp is canceled. But more on that later, and who knows where things might go. Cities, though, I guess the reason why people are not waiting to cancel camps and vacations is because they can't imagine a summer without those things, which
And they're at home with their kids right now. I think they're desperate for a summer camp, right?
Just a little bit, like online summer camp. Anyway, but one of the reasons why I think they're hopeful is that cities are starting to open up.
Yeah. I mean, indeed, the state of Tennessee, we're watching those orders. We've got 2 Launchpad locations in Tennessee. They are entering phase 1. So socially distance opening, masks in place, which is interesting, and just sort of interesting. Clearly this is being run at a state by state, county by county level.
Well, last week in New Jersey, Anthony, as you know, the government tweeted, "Don't F it up," when they opened up the car parks, and then the governor. Retweeted that as well, which is kind of awesome.
Loving New Jersey's got a real, in times of crisis, a sense of humor that probably is innate to being from New Jersey. You can, yeah.
Well, I guess you kind of are. You're kind of from New Jersey.
My grandparents lived there.
That's right. Lived out there in Orange.
Yeah.
Anyway, so let's talk about that. So Tennessee is opening up. And so that's giving people a sense of sort of where we're going and that things are going to actually start to go back. Mm-hmm. I also think that it is fair to say that where we're going and going back to normal are two different things. Going back to normal.
Yeah, reopening is not back to normal.
We're not, yeah. And where we're going is probably not back to normal. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say.
Not at all.
It's not at all. And you were reading a great article recently about the fact that while we're doing a lot to stem the increases in the virus, in people getting the virus, we are not yet actually doing anything to stop it.
Well, I mean, I think that's the interesting data that we're seeing right now, and we'll see what plays out. But I sent out a newsletter, and Lori Garrett, who sort of predicted the pandemic, not the coronavirus specifically, and it was a New York Times article that was interviewing her over the weekend. Not especially optimistic. I also included a couple different scenarios from a statistics website that sort of had different sources, and basically
Stats Web, we love it.
We've flattened the curve, but the curve is not showing any signs of declining. And now states are opening up. There's protests around the country. Some of the challenges and sicknesses and deaths are moving into rural areas, and things like the meat packing plants and all of that. So not especially bright news. And basically the way this is expected to play out is sort of waves, right? We're going to be, I think, the more and more, right, I'm getting comfortable with this is going to be with us for the next couple of years,
right? And
we're going to be going through waves of opening and closing. And so how does that's not just a 6-week, 2-month lockdown. That's how do we live with this and adapt with our lives and businesses and travel and
That's right.
Seeing families. I mean,
And in the spirit of, as things kind of progress, we're all getting more comfortable with new normal. So just like in Scientology, they don't tell you about the aliens until sort of the 7th wave. I think we're kind of getting indoctrinated into kind of the new future, slowly but surely.
Mm-hmm.
With summer around the corner, that gets concerning. But I think it's also very valid. People, again, love to say, it's going to go back to normal. Everything's fine. Your business is going to be great. And at the end of the day, it's not going back to normal. And I think we're seeing that through major companies are thinking about this in a different future. And I think we've been hearing a lot about layoffs and furloughs and challenges that companies have been facing. But as companies look to the future, we're also hearing from folks at Facebook or Google, Microsoft, that they're like, we're not going back to work that way. And we may not go back and repopulate our offices at all.
Yeah.
So when a global company like a Facebook or a Google or a Microsoft, who obviously like their office space is such a small price point, and they're saying, wait, no, we're actually going to rethink it. We are accelerating the future of work, and we're accelerating that notion of remote work. And you were talking about SaaStr.
Yeah, I mean, Jason Lemkin, leader with SaaStr and SaaStr Fund, has tweeted yesterday, we're not going back. We have, everybody's work from home. It's working okay. We're just not going back to the office. And Microsoft sent out a memo to employees yesterday that said work from home order is in effect until October. We're
and then
hearing
who
like
knows?
Microsoft's marketing team, may who knows, people, if people go back at all. So anyway, it is going to be interesting, but how that impacts office space, commercial office space, we're hearing from companies who are trying to get rid of, unload their leases, that kind of thing.
Oh yeah, we did hear that this weekend. That was great.
So
we do not need more inventory right now on the market in the
start a co-working space. That's a great idea.
Go start one. There's not enough out there that are struggling to make it work in this time of trouble. But support your existing local co-working space is our message. And in fact, we are going to be supporting so we're doing a tour of the country today on LPTV, but we are also talking about the fact that we are thinking about doing a tour of the country in a few months in real life, maybe if we can. And one of the things we're thinking about is, first of all, it's probably not going to be getting on a plane like we used to every week, which isn't so bad, right? Better for the environment, better for our family life, better for health and wellness, better for managing the pandemic. But we still got to connect, and we still have partners and projects and cities that we want to support, and entrepreneurs, and building the network. And so one of the things we're thinking about doing is, and it's interesting, it was an idea we had last fall, and now actually has a real reason for it. We thought it'd be fun, but now it's actually smart. And I love when those things come together.
They don't always get together.
They don't always go together. We're thinking about RVing across America this summer, and I bet a lot of people are thinking about that. So a way to socially distance, if we're allowed to leave our state and our home, of course, if shelter in place is lifted, and I don't think that that's a guarantee.
No.
Right? I don't think that's a guarantee, but if it were, our families live on the East Coast, and so the idea is they aren't going to see their granddaughter if we don't figure out how to do the 40-hour drive. So we're thinking about driving across America in an RV, but we also are going to take the opportunity to go and meet with our Launchpad cities. We've got a bunch of projects in the works. We've got some exciting things around the network and building relationships with other co-working spaces. And so we might as well do that at a distance and take LPTV on the road.
Exactly. And just as a shout out, we were talking with RV Share, which is the name of the company. They do one-way rentals.
Which is critical if you don't want to.
And maybe we fly back or maybe we drive back, but we'll see.
I don't think your mom wants an RV sitting in her front lawn for a month.
She'll be okay with it.
She'd be okay with that. Sort of like vacation style. So if you guys want to host us in your driveway on our way across America, we will host you here on LPTV as we take the family on the road, if we get the opportunity to do that. So,
yeah.
But before that, we can still stay in contact with our friends and our partners and our loved ones through this amazing platform. And so let's just transition and get started. So while you bring Ann up, our first guest.
Okay.
Todd, I will not take your teenagers on the road. And then again, for those of you on Facebook, we do not monitor our Facebook Live on this. We invite folks into a small and selected studio audience on our Zoom recording, but we will obviously publish this again. Ann Rogan, all right. Ann Rogan, one of my favorite Anns, combines entrepreneurial and global partnership experience to help define business strategy and new services for early stage companies. Her work in emerging markets, and literally her work is, I can't even keep up, has spanned sectors including education, healthcare, clean energy, digital identity, and she's co-founded 2 companies in renewables and 3D printing. This woman is like entrepreneurship at her heart. But currently, she is leading economic innovation for Mayor Michael Tubbs' office in Stockton, California, and that oversees workforce access, green economy opportunities, and community wealth, including our favorite opportunities.
Opportunity zones, yep.
That's how we met Ann. And Ann, it's great to have you. I get to see you again. We were on a conference last week.
We were.
And we seem to be on conference calls on a regular basis. We were joking. Ann and I were working on this big initiative called Ecosystem Summit a couple months ago, which was a program that Chris and I founded where we would bring ecosystem leaders together to talk about the challenges they face in their ecosystem. And it's an amazing program. People really love it. We were going to bring it to Stockton, California. And then we had this brilliant idea about hopping on a bus all together and doing some wine tasting here in Sonoma as this like added benefit. And Ann and I were on the phone last week and we were like, remember that time? Good idea to have people take a bus together all across the US who are major leaders in driving economic change.
Seems like ages ago.
Have them have some wine tasting. And we realized now, we were like, those are ideas you have in a pre-COVID world. Those ideas are no longer appropriate in a post-COVID world, are they?
COVID came for us.
We can still drink wine.
Yes.
Hopefully someday together. All right. So Ann, thank you for joining us today. I think one of the things we talked about, we did a panel last week on OZs, or opportunity zones, and I thought it was very, one of the things that you talked about is that as we are entering this kind of post-COVID experience or during COVID realistically, the way we thought about opportunity zones kind of needs to change. And it's an opportunity, for lack of a better word, to rewrite the rules, to have an there. So do you want to talk about what you're seeing on the ground in Stockton today, what you're working on, and kind of how you see that going?
Yeah, so just to set context, the past 45 days or so, we have been, local government, I think, local governments across the country have been just trying to block and tackle, and then try and sort of build some of the recovery into the immediate relief stuff. And so as we're doing that across food and small business and childcare and other areas, the question around how do you transition small business and startups into a COVID context, into a post-COVID context is really, really hard. And I think, we're not strangers to the deficiencies of opportunity zones pre-COVID. Yeah. And there's just challenges now that are unraveling even further. And so the question is sort of like, if a lot of businesses were not beneficiaries of OZ investment pre-COVID, what chance do we stand post-COVID, right? And as you guys know, like a lot of these investors are already look at communities like Stockton, and even the sort of the lower 90% of opportunity zones, as we describe them, as highly risk oriented, and they're not oriented towards risk. And so the appetite, I think, in a post-pandemic context becomes even more of a challenge. That argument becomes even tougher to make.
Yeah, and I think it's an opportunity, which is we're basically just like, take the Band-Aid off.
Yeah.
It's okay. It never achieved all of its potential, but now you're seeing on the ground so many factors that actually need to be addressed in the immediate term. Kind of how are you thinking about the work you're doing? And if you could just share with us some of the things that Stockton's doing to be really reactive to the during COVID phase of this transition.
So a couple things. One, the city dedicated $1.2 million from its general fund surplus towards addressing things like homelessness, small business, and community well-being. And so that was sort of a really important kind of foundational stake in the ground to say, hey, city really cares about these issues and recognizes its role. The mayor then said, okay, I'm going to match that, and I'd raise $1 million of philanthropic support to dedicate towards nonprofits and small business relief. Over the last 2 weeks, we've put together about $500,000, so some from the city, some from philanthropy, to invest into about 160 somewhat businesses as micro grants. And that's been, the pandemic is obviously forcing collaborations that should have taken place before, but I think are forcing collaboration in new ways. Then we're also looking a lot at food security. The increase at our emergency food bank has increased by 300% in a matter of 4 weeks. And we're seeing that in New Jersey and other places as well. The New York Times did an article about it. So we partnered with Alice Waters to an edible schoolyard project to get fresh produce into the hands of seniors. We brought on DoorDash to manage sort of the last mile delivery piece of that. And the food security piece is now, we were an early mover. And so now we're trying to figure out with the state of California coming on board with a couple different food initiatives. We're trying to figure out locally, okay, like what's the jigsaw puzzle here? So how does the current need map to what we've built? And does that put us out of existence? In which case, very happy to go out of business on food security. But where is there duplication? Where are the white spaces remain? And just sort of constantly trying to monitor that. So I would say that for us, the big issues have been food security, homelessness and housing, and small business. Childcare is obviously for frontline workers something we've been trying to figure out as well.
Hey, so that actually brings up a good point, which is these are issues that have faced all of the communities. Really, realistically, these are all issues that face communities that have strong opportunity zones, big tracts, right? Because it's based on census tracts. And you've been fighting the fight and this challenge for many years. This isn't like new. Is this helping to accelerate some of the programs in the city to solve these challenges that you've been facing?
Accelerate what? So
like accelerate the longer term fixes that have been needed around kind of food security, homelessness, things like that, that maybe have been moving. Like for us, there are lots of challenges that we see that have been moving slowly, and this is sort of accelerating actually the improvement.
Yeah, it depends on the issue. I mean, I would say for some of the topics we're tackling, it's just sort of like exposing all the cracks at the same time. I would say for food security, that's been my experience, is that it's exposing all these cracks simultaneously of the existing system and of how much food security, how fragile really these ecosystems as cities really are. I think on the homelessness and housing front, it's exposing a lot of cracks there too, but Project Roomkey is rapidly trying to convert motels and hotels into temporary shelter for homeless. Now, we talk about going back to normal. Back to is challenging because was pre-COVID ideal? Not for a lot of people. And so I think the pandemic is an opportunity for us to, I think to your point, accelerate, like, why haven't we been able to figure out rapid rehousing for homelessness in the state of California? And is the pandemic accelerating that? I think it is. But in the case of, say, food or small business, I don't think that we have accelerated towards our solutions. I don't think we know necessarily what it is just yet. So I think it depends on what you're talking about, but certainly this is the speed of work is pretty phenomenal. It may feel slow as a citizen of these cities, but a lot of folks are working really, really hard to put pieces into place.
Yeah. And I know that the immediacy of the crisis right now is sort of a food, water, and shelter, kind of rapid response, which you're talking about some of the things that Stockton has been doing, that you've been leading there. Talking a little bit about the Launchpad role, which probably hasn't come up yet, but just thinking about the small business environment, and any like in particular, I'm wondering about the super commuters from Stockton, right? Stockton has a sort of a culture and a number of people who have to commute to the Bay Area. Are there any, do you think that there are some things that this may accelerate, some change that we have been hoping for, where people are able to work remotely, telecommute, that there's an opportunity to ignite or continue to ignite sort of the entrepreneurial activity and create new business creation in Stockton, coming out of this?
Yeah, a couple thoughts. One, it's never been cheaper to hire a startup team than during a crisis. So for anyone who's looking to hire, now's probably a decent time to be doing that. Two, I think there's just because of the shutdown across the state, whenever I take a trip outside of the city for some essential service or to see family, the freeway is extremely empty as compared to a normal commuting day, right? So we usually export tens of thousands of workers over the Altamont every single day into the Bay Area. But that's not happening. And so I think as we kind of reimagine what the future of work looks like, there's a lot of people that are sitting in their front yards, myself included, with a laptop and a chair and an internet connection. So what does a decentralized co-working space look like? A lot of communities like Stockton don't have high-speed internet. And so when you think about the school district and you think about households, the school district has been grappling and trying to figure out how do you get hundreds of thousands of hotspots into communities and neighborhoods across the city. That same gap exists for working, right? So it's not that people don't want to work. If they can, if they have the luxury of working from home or working remotely, that's a huge benefit, because it means you're not necessarily you're doing frontline work. But if you have that ability, you may not have the ability to have a high-speed, stable internet connection. And so I think that's something where I think private telecom companies and the state should be paying attention to, because that's an opportunity that this is exposing that could actually bring a ton of benefits during the pandemic and post-pandemic. And then finally,
CC Google Fiber,
for example. And then the third piece is Lithuania. So Lithuania, just for kicks, has their capital city has turned into a massive open air cafe. And they're doing this retaining social distancing. So when you think about whether California, the question is not whether California should open or not, it's to what degree and by when. And I think creatively thinking about whether you're a startup working from home or whether you're a small business that offers, you're a masseuse or you're a hair salon, you have to be able to do business, right? And so what would it look like for cities in California or cities across the country if they converted public spaces into massive open air markets? And they may get 40% of their customers or even less than that. The point is that you get people out into the outdoors, you're socially distanced, you're doing so presumably safely, and you're still sort of being able to bring people together in a way that is hopefully a stimulus and is a release valve for people's sanity. Right? Like
it's a great idea.
It's a little like, remember when we used to have sidewalk sales?
Exactly.
Right?
It's a sidewalk sale gone wild.
Amazing.
And Stockton already has the stock market, right? That's been going on over the years, and so get them involved.
I like it because it's true. We do the first thing to open up was farmers markets, right? So we can go to our farmers market, which is this like super sense of normalcy,
right?
Everybody's social distanced. It's it's lighter than normal. You've got and everyone's wearing masks, and I think that's interesting.
I think, and you think about it, it's pretty low tech. It's a pretty low tech solution. It requires some city buy-in and repurposing spaces, which I think is kind of the name of the game anyway. But it takes some imagination. It takes some, city buy-in. But at the end of the day, whether you're a restaurant or a masseuse, I think there's potential there, I think.
Yep.
I love it. And I love hearing what's fascinating to me is I think we have to throw all of the things at the window and be creative, right? And so we can learn from others that are doing cool things. And as we wrap up, I just wanted to say thank you. I think it's interesting. We've got first responder roles who are obviously on the front lines in the hospitals, the grocery clerks, and folks doing that. But I think we are, I just want to point out, it's folks who are actually working in the cities who are thinking about kind of all of the big challenges that we as ecosystems face. I really appreciate it. And something I mentioned to you a couple of weeks ago was, while the rest of us are sheltering in place, and while we're trying to maybe navigate whether or not, all of our businesses survive, we're really grateful because I've been super excited to hear about how you've been on the front lines of getting folks with new ideas and new studies and getting volunteers from the Bay Area to help out with Stockton, help out with the initiatives. And so we're grateful to that work for you going and putting your hat on and your face mask on and getting down to the business of supporting business. Because I think a lot of businesses don't have the energy to necessarily find their next act yet. And now, as we emerge, knowing that those things have been handled by folks. Sometimes some of us just have to stay home and some of us have to do the work. So we're really grateful for you and grateful for your support, and of course grateful to your, the city of Stockton for your partnership and support for our community.
As are we. We are immensely grateful to you guys, and we are working around the clock to make sure that what we do is responding to the needs of the community. But I think in general, small business and startups, I'm glad they have an advocate in you guys. So
you will be our first stop if we get to take this RV.
We're ready for you. My driveway is open.
We'll have a socially distanced ecosystem without anyone else.
Cool.
All right, we're gonna let
Thank
you
you guys.
go. Thanks.
All right, coming up. Do you want me to do the intro?
Yeah,
while
why
you're
don't you do the
inviting
intro, and
Anthony,
I'll
it's going to be
bring-
great to see you. It's been so many months since we were there. With over a decade of experience in tech, media, speaking, and coaching aspiring entrepreneurs and students from underserved groups, Anthony Fraiser has developed a thoroughly different point of view. He finds the common threads between lessons he learned in the hard streets of Newark, New Jersey, to the innovative clusters of Silicon Valley, and he shares with listeners and readers that success isn't something external. It comes from within. You can create your own luck, no matter what your background or lack of experience might be. Anthony currently serves as the entrepreneur in residence of Newark Venture Partners, a fund backed by Audible and Amazon, and he helps to attract innovative tech startups to Newark and incubate promising talent locally. He's also one of our favorite people and was the OG first believer in Newark for Launchpad.
Yeah, first one. I still remember the construction.
I know.
That's
I
right.
know.
Remember you guys met via Tweet Connect?
We got connected on Twitter, and as I started coming to Newark, we got to know each other. You came in and toured the space and helped us get the space off the ground. So we're so grateful for that, and excited to hear what's going on in Newark. It looks like there's some interesting construction going on in Newark behind you there.
Oh yeah. Everybody thinks this is construction. I don't know. It's like good art. I don't know what it is actually. It's like an artist that I liked all his stuff. I don't know exactly what the structure is back there, but I was like, I need a good Zoom background. So
yeah, I love it.
All right. Well, good to see you. How are you doing? I've got a couple things I want to cover, but just want to hear how you're doing and what's going on in your world these days.
I'm good. I'm just socially distancing like everyone else, and making sure my family is good, and that's first and foremost. But then after that, of course, still trucking. I'm in the middle of building a startup and growing a startup, and so had to make that transition to being mostly remote, which hasn't been as tough because not like we had that many people anyway, but it's been different when you're forced to be remote rather than doing it by choice. Exactly.
Cool.
Well, great. And talk to us a little bit about what you're doing, because I know your background with ABF Creative. I think of you as a leader in media and in particular in podcasting, both with content production of your own, but also producing other people's and other sort of corporate podcasts.
Yeah.
We're in a whole new world right now. This is like, we're in the game doing this. Like we sort of popped up with Launchpad TV because
Anthony's like, you old guys, get out of there.
I know, we're like, okay, we got to figure it out. But you're a pro, and you've been doing this for a number of years. And it seems like the moment is meeting the medium now. When we can't connect in person, we got to connect visually and over audio. So talk to us a little bit about what you're doing right now.
So right now with ABF Creative, we started initially as almost like a work for hire studio, where we were, working with brands like Prudential, working with brands like the Grammy Museum. We worked with Random House at one point, BET. So there's all these different brands that we were working with. But now we're kind of like, we're still doing those kind of podcasts, but now we're expanding to being a network. So we're trying to build an entire network of podcasts for multicultural audiences, mainly African-American millennials. We feel like there's a big void in the marketplace right now. The podcast listening audience mirrors the US population. So about 23% of podcast listeners are African-American and Latino, but most podcasts are created and for, mainly white Caucasian males. And so we feel like there's a big void for us. Yeah. So we want to fill that void. And it's, it's not it's all about just great content for our audience, showcasing shared values. And we're in the beginning of that. We raised like a pre-seed round. And so super early still, but this I would say pandemic didn't really slow anything down. A lot of production can still be done remotely.
Yeah. Hey, one quick question is, I think as you were on the beginning of the journey there, anything changed as you've been kind of looking at the landscape and when everything's kind of fallen apart here as a result of the pandemic? Are you kind of doing any shifts or changes in the strategy?
A little bit. So we want to make sure that, content wise, it's definitely changing in a sense where demand is there. Before I was a little bit slow, like, oh yeah, we can develop this and let's take our time and let's get it out. Let's make sure it's all good. And while we still put a focus on quality, you can't miss this moment, and so, we have to ramp up production. So we have a show that's coming out in 2 weeks. We have a children's show that we're working on that's going to be out in about 3 weeks. And so we just have to ramp everything up and get it out. And really and that to me is the biggest change, is really like, we can't really rest now. And take out, we have to be urgent.
I love that.
Yeah.
You can't miss this moment.
I know.
If you're going to be leaders, right, at the end of the day, you can react or adapt, but it's much better to lead and just, take the ball, run with it, and move into that position. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's definitely.
It feels to me, one of the ways I've described Newark, we sort of think about, a lot of times, cities and ecosystems, you want to have a little bit of a vertical focus, like what business really makes sense to be built there. And
Mm-hmm.
we've talked about this a little bit before, but Newark's a little bit of a sort of an emerging, media empire, and in, the podcast medium in particular. Between you, Gerard Adams, Tiffany, the Budgetnista, there's people with, major audiences that are being built out of Newark. What do you think? Is that, sort of the media environment of being in the, greater New York metro area? Is that, the personalities of a lot of the folks in the city?
Newark is a very art town. Newark is filled with artists. Newark is for artists. That's like the mantra these days. And so art comes in many shapes and sizes and looks and feels, and media is just one of many art forms that Newarkers have adapted to, and so you named a lot of good people. Tiffany Budgetnista is a young lady named Monica Sutton who's really in the children's space, who's really doing great work on YouTube. Her channel is blowing up. There's new podcast studios popping up. There's one called Bricks Lab that just launched. And they also produce podcasts as well. And so it's really, and then we can't forget Audible. Being an anchor institution in audio in the city of Newark. And so it's almost like everything is lined up for Newark to really take media to the next level. Everything is there. You know, and Newark is like, I always say this, Newark is a big city with a small town vibe. So, you know, people are close to each other. So there's room for a lot of collaboration in the city of Newark. And so I think that's the most exciting thing is like when we talk about not missing the moment, we can't miss the moment when it comes to that either. Because, you know, a lot of people like to network up and network down. But, you know, it's the peers that are where the real gold is. And I just, you know, someone said this on my podcast recently. And so that stuck with me. And I started to really think about people who you could start networking with, you know, who are our peers. And so that's a big thing too in Newark. Collaboration is huge.
I love that. Peers are where the real gold is. That's right.
Yeah.
And I also love that story. You know, I think it's been interesting. Audible was a good Newark first believer too, right? Which is, let's put our headquarters here, let's commit, let's actually support the ecosystem and build in the downtown. And, you know, I think it's interesting because I think Newark has a good mix of a lot of different folks who want to make it a really vibrant place.
Yeah. Audible being an audio company, you know, there's only so much. They can do a lot socially, but as far as the business is concerned, you know, there weren't a lot of audio-focused companies in Newark. For Audible to really come through and support, you know, so now that we see a lot of media, audio-focused companies popping up, we can start to see Audible really get more involved with these companies in helping to grow them, you know, and now they have all the resources there that are available to make sure that there is a thriving ecosystem that they can 100% participate in as far as helping to plant the seeds in. And so Audible's been really a big supporter of my endeavors. We actually just signed a deal with Audible. So we have an audio documentary that's going to be coming out this year on the Audible platform as an Audible original.
That's
No,
awesome.
That's great. Congratulations.
Right on, man.
Are you ready to plug it yet? Does it have a name yet?
I can plug it. You know, I don't. As far as I know, I don't know. I never signed anything that said I couldn't. But no, it's an audio documentary on engineer named Gerald Lawson.
Okay.
And he was the engineer of one of the first video game consoles. So he was an African American from Queens who was in the same computer club as Steve Jobs when he moved to California. And he created a console called the Fairchild Channel F, which came before Atari.
That's interesting. That's going to be fascinating. And that documentary format has been a really interesting format because it's kind of fun to do a deep dive. You know, this is like an interview format, but do a deep dive.
You love a deep dive.
I do.
I've told him he's not.
It's a lot of work.
Yeah,
it's fun.
I know.
It's a ton of work, and but it is fun. We're discovering new things and just really, it's so interesting how complex a life lived is. Like, I've never really examined someone's life before in detail. And so it's just amazing to really put the microscope on someone's life and find out these interesting details that the world will soon hear. So
good. Well, congratulations. We'll be looking out for that. Last question here. Any words of wisdom or advice for, you know, sort of aspiring podcasters or people getting started in this, you know, like us or anybody watching? You've obviously been doing this for a number of years. You know, you've got a studio, so one option would be working with you, but you know, building an audience, you know, takes time. And you mentioned the comment about talking to your peers before. What would you leave us with for people who are trying to build an audience for their medium?
I think you guys are doing the right thing. I think the biggest thing is consistency. You know, consistency creates luck. You know, I think sometimes when we start, we work to try and make it look perfect and make it sound perfect, make it feel perfect. But to be honest, it's really just all about the consistency, because eventually something's going to pop. I've seen people on social media all the time. They posted, I remember seeing this girl, she posts videos and she had like 15 people watching and nobody would ever be watching her videos. And I'm like, man, I mean, I would click like because I support her. But all it took was one moment where one of her videos went viral and a celebrity retweeted it and it blew up all over the place. Now her average views are like maybe 5,000 views every time she posted something on social media, a video or something like that. But she only got that because she was consistent. If she didn't put out a ton of content, she would have never created the environment to get lucky. So to me, I think it's consistency and then it's distribution. And distribution meaning take the content and put it on on different platforms natively. So like, this video could be chopped up a million different ways. It can be placed on LinkedIn. It can be placed on Twitter. It can be placed on Instagram. It can be placed on Facebook, and just distribute your content all over the place. And long as you are consistent and you're distributing, eventually something's gonna, you'll reach that point where the audience starts to build. So
that's great.
It seems like you liking video might be a correlation.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, throw us a like, and we'll stay in touch. Hopefully, get to see you again soon. But really good to see your face, and give our best to everybody, all the friends and community in Newark. And we'll let you go now, Anthony. But good to see you. Thanks for
peace.
Bye, Anthony. All right. While we're bringing up Brian, I wanted to ask the audience if everybody is, one of the things I wanted to talk about on a serious note, is I wanted to just celebrate one of our members and talk a little bit about the fact that, so we have been every month trying to give relief to those members who are the most in need. And I just wanted to do a big shout out because this last month, we had a member come back and say that they would not accept our relief because they recognize that, rent's still due, Wi-Fi still gets paid, cleaning staff is still there, we furloughed our staff, et cetera, et cetera. And I just want to do another shout out to our members and to those of us who are sort of cheering us along and supporting us. We know we're getting annoying to the other member who said maybe we should cut down on the email frequency. I get it. You're right. But nonetheless, we are grateful and to those of you who have helped us along the way. And I know I see one of you watching. I am personally grateful for your support. And thank you very much. And let's bring up Brian.
Okay.
But Brian is the co-founder of Shift Capital, an impact urban real estate group driving mission-oriented capital, collaborative resources, and inclusive strategies into underserved communities. We met Brian via our Opportunity Zone work. This is kind of like an OZ play, and this is the first time I'm seeing you live. Isn't that crazy, Brian, after all these months? Anyway, he's focused on finding better solutions at the intersection of society's most difficult urban challenges, intergenerational poverty, urban revitalization, and access to opportunity and community displacement. Brian, we are so happy to have you. Brian comes to us from Philly. Home.
I'm currently in Connecticut, but yes, Philly roots here.
All right, good stuff. Well, it's great to see you. Great to have you on board. Do you have kids, Brian?
I do, and if we're lucky, they may make an appearance unplanned. I have two daughters. I have an 11 and 8-year-old.
Oh, thank God. They're not yet on TikTok. I was going to ask you if you've had to do some dad TikToking.
We're holding strong. We're holding strong, but it's coming on. But I will say to some earlier points, camp is still on as of now.
Oh, good.
So we are,
crossing your fingers. That's because they don't want to give you your deposit back.
That's right. I know, but I still need something to believe in, I
We
think
gotta
camp
go.
have some.
Let's believe in camp.
Ann Rogan was talking about the outdoors is okay. So
Yeah,
as long as your
true.
camp is in the great outdoors, you know.
What happens? You think those kids are going to be good at social distancing in those cabins? You know what? Maybe camp will be on.
I think
the problem is that
need it.
And they're going to be quarantined they'll just make camp all summer and quarantined, and everybody just sends their kids away, and we'll just call it COVID camp.
I'm in. I'll double my deposit.
Right.
I hear you. Okay, so you're not on TikTok yet, because one of my things that I tapped into TikTok one morning at 5 a.m. And one of my favorite parts of it was like they have like parent TikTok and all these things, you know, as they make fun of those of us in older generations. And it was really enjoyable for me to see that millennial TikTok was trending. So folks kids who use TikTok, who are the cool TikTok ones, are making fun of millennials, as in like the millennials are old. So for those of us who are Gen X, let's just let that sink in a little bit. It's now them. Finally.
That's right.
But then does that make us boomers?
Yeah.
No, never.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I hope not.
But anyway, millennial TikTok, it's a thing.
All right.
And basically it's the next generation making fun of millennials, and it's finally happening. So I feel like that's coming home.
Yep.
Anyway, let's jump into the
so obviously Shift Capital, big investor developer with a real social conscience in Philly, with a particular focus in Kensington. Lot to talk about, but just curious about what this has meant and how you're navigating the current environment on things.
Well, this is not a surprise to anybody, but it's for those of us working on the fringes of development. I think they were already vulnerable, whether they're small businesses or the neighborhoods that we work in. We're all feeling it. Whether it's money that the city was investing in the corridor that's getting pulled back now. The Commerce Department just announced that investments in our areas are going to get pulled back and cut back. We have a series of buildings called Macon Studios that hold about probably 60 to 70 small businesses. We've watched probably 4 of them go out of business in the last 2 weeks. We've, like you all, have been doing aggressive deferrals and aggressive pushbacks, and been negotiating with our lenders and then trying to pass that along to our tenants as much as possible. And like you gave your shout out. I mean, we've had our tenant or two that has said, you know what, we're paying rent this month, because we probably could make an argument for why we shouldn't, but we recognize we're probably in better shape than others. I think that I think it's been tough for a city that was rebounding, that was growing, that was really starting to get some mojo in areas that it hadn't before. There's a EIG report that just came out this morning on poverty that identified that there are I think it's twice as many high poverty neighborhoods as there were in 1980. The reality is that every time as we go through a boom, we start to get to turning towards some of these neighborhoods, maybe, we hit something like this, and then guess what funding and what resources and and interest and focus gets pulled back on a lot of the neighborhoods that we're working in. So, a lot of concern. Optimistically though, I think Ann, you were mentioning this earlier in the podcast, but I'm really optimistic that people are going to start to realize what it's like to live in, you know, some of these shoes that people live in all the time. You know, people who had not been exposed, who are in places of power, you know, feeling what it's like to feel this financial fear and this uncertainty, and realizing that, you know, a good chunk of these neighborhoods and a lot of these small businesses that put it all on the line, you know, been living with this uncertainty all the time. So I'm optimistic that there is opportunities for systematic change as a result of all this.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, which is we were remarking on how quickly the overall economy contracted, right? And it's not about people taking a month off. It's actually about people as a collective whole saying, being vulnerable. We've had this explosion in vulnerable populations, but even those who have privilege and have some wealth are contracting because they're realizing that, like, we have to sustain and we have to do that. And then that has this massive knock-on effect across the economy. And it's so fascinating that, like, the doors just went like that fast. And as much as we have a landlord who's like, you guys were giving me a call on the first day, we're like, that's because we saw the situation coming and we're being responsible to say, let's be thoughtful about how we navigate the next few months. But it happened across everything. And I think that you're right, which is it makes us all ask a question about the lifestyles that we were living and the privileges that we had. And it shines a really big light, as Ann was mentioning, Ann Rogan, the other Ann, younger, smarter, harder working, who she's saying, you know, she's seeing more cracks than they anticipated, and we're seeing all the cracks, which is why the work you're doing is so important.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think that, you know, the most important thing for us is to shine a light on where those cracks are that people might not be paying attention to. So, you know, our biggest concern is as things get pulled back, you know, right now financing is nearly impossible. So, you know, we worked hard to get a Marriott at one of the toughest intersections in Philadelphia. They committed, we were moving through the process, and now, you know, no financing group in the world is going to finance a hotel at the moment, more or less, you know, a hotel that's sitting, you know, at Broad Erie, North Philadelphia. And
I mean, that's worse than a co-working space.
Well, you guys aren't far behind that list of challenging financing. But yes, it is worse. There are things harder. And, you know, what scares me is, I think this point you were making earlier about the new normal, right? So what does the new normal do for the type of work that we do, the type of work that you all do? And are the investments in the long term going to happen over the next 2 years? You know, for example, you know, we were just having a conversation this morning about a Vietnamese coffee group that we've been working with for 2.5 years. And they were going to anchor one of our main projects that was under construction. And they were going to take 3,000 square feet and open up their first retail location. And, you know, it's minority owned and women led. And the question was, wow, should we actually create a smaller footprint for them? You know, I mean, we're doing a lot of the investing on their TI. And the question is, should it be 1,000 square feet, more of kind of a grab and go? And, you know, our response was, how long is the new normal? You know, in the new normal, yes, that actually makes a lot of sense. But to your point, I love your value point of we go long, right? I'm going to add that to my list. If we're going long, does cutting back really make sense for, you know, what is needed and what should be there in a communal space and in a larger space that people can be a part of? And the truth is, we don't know. And as a result, financing groups don't know. And so they're not going to take risks in the next, you know, period of time. So how do we keep this momentum going? How do we get Launchpad to Philadelphia? How do we do the things that we know are going to strengthen the city, but right now are just going to be really hard.
Yeah. Well, on Launchpad, we've got some ideas. We can talk about that later.
Oh, great.
And we'll take the RV tour. We'll try and hit you up.
Some of the things that that you've already been doing probably become more important now. We were getting some comments. We had a woman who runs a telehealth company on a few weeks ago, and I was reading you included telehealth, telemedicine as an amenity in one of your recent buildings. As an offering for tenants. It feels like some of these sort of full service things, live, work, and play in one building, maybe less commuting, more staying close to home, whether you're sheltering in home or whether you're able to live and work there. There are going to be, new concepts that we can incorporate, that will help attract people to these neighborhoods and new projects.
Yeah, we launched this service with a group called Health Plus, who's bringing telehealth services in particular into affordable housing projects. We have a series of 100 single family homes, and we just, in a community that have a lot of single mothers, working mothers who have kids at home who probably and making maybe minimum wage, and the interesting thing is we launched this along with a free internet service with Comcast. So combining the telehealth and the technology, making that a part of your rental, your rent payment. But we really struggled with getting people onboarded. We've now integrated onto the front end of our leasing system. So hopefully it happens as people come into our ecosystem. But the ones that were already in it, it was hard to get. We were basically saying, here's free telehealth services. And, 100, we got like 3 signed up. And, this is to this larger point of what things get accelerated in this world right now. So,
right.
Those who maybe were reluctant to grocery shop online have now battled through the mental, hurdles of going to do that. And now we're doing it. And so now what is that going to mean for grocery stores when we open back up? And in the same way, telehealth is, I think, a moment in time that was coming, but was actually, struggling for adoption. You talk to anybody in the telehealth world, adoption was still not there. And maybe this is the moment that really gets that accelerated for the better. It's going to disrupt a lot of stuff, but I think that's optimistically something that we think, especially in lower income communities where this telehealth service is not a luxury, it is fitting a need. I think it would be great to see that get accelerated here.
Yeah, it's funny when you put offers in front of people, because we build partnerships and create offers that we think, we go into them from a very strong perspective of this is going to be actually good. And so obviously everybody would want this, and this is a great amenity. We probably even do customer development. But the reality is that, and I've seen this time and time again, no matter how good that offer is, our attention span is so limited that actually being able to cut through the clutter to get people to see, wow, and then convert them is changing. And I think on telehealth, this is like something that it makes so much sense, but it's been so slow to come across all those platforms.
Yeah.
And as a provider, we think about partnership. We're like, look at this amazing amenity that we've come up with, and it's great. And why wouldn't you want it? And it's like almost too good to be true. And you're like, scroll. Wait, I need this thing on Instagram from some crazy provider, X, Y, and Z. And so it's interesting because in a world where we're so distracted, it's harder than ever to break through that noise, even when you have something really good like that. So you kind of got to be everybody hard. And now in a world where it's all virtual and things are coming at us all over the place, and we don't even have the benefit of the water cooler catch up to understand that it's cool, it'll be interesting. But I do think there's a trend which says that hyper local notion, and what's more local than the folks in your apartment building, right? So just gonna have to go back to good old fashioned flyer.
Well, and also I think I think like what you all are doing and the way that you look at even what you're doing now, you all are constantly thinking about what's your value add, what are the amenities that you can bring that strengthen your community and strengthen, and frankly strengthen the community members themselves. And I think that this type of world fits into this. I mean, that's what we've been trying to do is, okay, the typical landlord relationship is, a very kind of animostic and traditionally very problematic relationship. So, co-working exists because someone, thought very cleverly, that, there was a better way to do it. And there was a more value add. You could bring value add services to tenants in addition to the short-term leases and all those other things. But, I think that type of thinking needs to now permeate in a lot of areas. And, that's why we have the telehealth services. That's why we have the technology, meeting people where they are every day. In your case, work. In our case, where they live. That's when you're probably going to have the best attention span to try to, bring things that are value add. But I agree. I mean, I'm sure you all feel this. You have this great idea, you roll it out, and then you're shocked by that everyone isn't doing it. The adoption rate isn't what you thought it was.
Yeah.
Like Chris's newsletter.
Yeah, why are people
I read it all the time. Don't worry.
Well, it's a very interesting sort of, environment that we're in right now. And, as a mission-driven organization, Launchpad, I know that Shift Capital is mission-driven. We're in an environment, sort of jumping off of a landlord offering, healthcare to tenants. You're right. It's a very different relationship, but it's going to take all of us in a very holistic approach to, the systemic change that needs to happen, right? Providing, support and access and opportunity for vulnerable populations that have not seen over the last 20 years, the economic growth that, the 1% or 10% or whatever have, and that income gap sort of disparity. So I'm curious if you, this sort of the last question and just, what your thoughts are on who needs to be involved. We had a guest on Rob Lauka last week who said, everything now needs to be a public-private partnership. We need, state and federal funding, Impact Hub. Yesterday put up the 10X challenge, which is challenging, philanthropic organizations to 10X the level of effort that they had been making in whatever their scope is, just prior to this. Clearly when the work that Shift does and that Launchpad does is sort of these are sort of edge cases for business models, and everything needs to really work for us, for our business models to work and have impact in the communities that we care about. So where do you see us marshaling the resources, to continue the work that we know needs to be done over the coming weeks, months, and years?
Well, let me first say that I think in my mind, I think we need to be clear about what it is, what kind of resources need to come to the table. So first, I'm a huge believer that we don't have enough risk capital that will accept lower returns to do either more impact, more investment in entrepreneurs of color, take risks where traditional capital is just not taking those risks. So where that comes from, I think, has been, something that we've been trying to figure out this for years. I think cautiously optimistic. I am always hopeful that the impact investing world as a whole starts to get more on this train. To date, my experience has been that they want their impact and they want to get their returns too. And as a result, they haven't really, it hasn't been a lot of capital that's moved into this. That's one. Two, I'm a believer of what Rob has said and what Ross Baird and Bruce Katz has said, which is, the amount of capital that's sitting on the endowments and foundations books is just massive. And it's getting, taking those dollars, taking it out of, 2-3% uni bonds or whatever, and moving it into, taking risks on, real estate developers of color, small businesses in corridors, small businesses that are probably 75% of your tenants, right? I think if we're throwing capital around and money federally around at, PPP and all this other stuff, we've got the ability to do this. Mm-hmm. It can happen, and it will have enormous economic effects if we can figure out how to unlock real capital. I'll leave it that. I'll leave it on my optimistic. So that's where I think it needs to come from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I love that, which is, we need to rethink about how capital flows. Even philanthropic dollars have been so locked up in sort of pet projects or how it gets dispersed or folks who actually control that. The reality is, and I won't say anything about statues, but Scott, but one of the things that I hammer the desk with is, when it was in opportunity zones, these investors don't actually understand how to write the check size that these businesses need to be able to not just survive, but thrive. And so as a result, I'm like, look, if you have a $297 million project, round it up to 300 million, right? And by the way, that $3 million will have an outsized impact on the community around it. And don't worry about underwriting it because you don't care about it because you're literally rounding up your multi-million dollar, hundreds of million dollar project. And I think that's the message to philanthropy, which is let the funds flow.
Yeah.
Worry about it because the check size is so small and the impact can be so good. And if you constrain it with traditional modes of actually distribution, you're just making it painful for the developer that's trying to do something good. You're making it hard for people to actually pay their rent. You're making it hard for actually us to be able to and create the kind of ecosystems that we need to thrive. And those dollars can have such a huge impact on food insecurity, but also on the increase of businesses and the support for the developments that we're doing. And so I think this is a time where we're shining a light on that. Mm-hmm. And those of us who are leading the charge on opportunity zones, we need to actually create a new dynamic in the future, which supports all of our work, right? Which is placemaking is not about pet projects. Placemaking is about getting funds flowing to all of the entrepreneurs. And it's not about funds flowing for return. It's about funds flowing for impact and activation. And if we don't activate developments, then you've got a bunch of buildings, Brian, that aren't worth very much.
Yeah. That's right. I agree.
Yeah.
So let's activate those buildings.
All right. Brian, thank you very much for being with us today. Good to check in here, and we'll obviously keep in touch, and maybe on the RV tour see you this summer. We'll see what happens, and hopefully you're able
every Tuesday and Thursday on LPTV.
Ship your kids off.
You're bringing the kid?
We're bringing the kid.
Oh yeah, the whole family.
Are you kidding?
All
Who
right.
would want to be on an RV
Awesome.
for an 18-month-old? All right.
Oh, boy.
All right.
Bye, Brian.
We'll let you go. Thank you for being with us.
All right. Next up, tomorrow on the wind down, I'm pumped for this one. Helena Price Hambrecht from House will be joining us.
And her husband, Woody.
Her husband, Woody.
Yeah.
And we're going to be giving away bottles of House to our lucky audience members. Not all of them. I'm not Oprah. Thursday, we're going to host John Atkinson of the Idea Village in New Orleans and other New Orleans Launchpad member Aaron Gilmore from Grassroots Food. And next week, we are gearing up for a very exciting week. It's going to be Pivot Week.
All right.
Pivot Week.
Is that like Shark Week?
It's the greatest thing since Shark Week on LPTV.
Lots of pivots going on.
Lots of pivots. I mean, if you're not pivoting now,
When would you?
hopefully you're building your great business. I don't know. Sorry. But pivot next week. We're going to be talking about people making the pivot and getting some tips and tricks from some experts. And it's going to be a great week. I'm excited with all of our guests. So.
Okay. Well, thank you to Ann and Anthony and Brian for joining us on the show today. Really interesting to hear the check-ins from people from all over the country. These are all great individuals and organizations working very hard to navigate this crisis and build their communities in the cities that they care deeply about. And thank you to our audience for joining us today.
A lot of good comments in the
comments in the chat, and we will see you next time. Thanks, guys. So long.